screen. Yeah, so it's called Radical Solutions to Thinking About Racist Systems. And part of that, and today, sort of this lunchtime, we're going to be talking about a vision for a service called Fikaweli, thinking about what that service might be, what implications there might be for staffing, for service users, and then just come to, at the end, to think about surviving racism, although racism is a theme throughout. In terms of definitions, obviously these are broad definitions, and this is basically just for the use of the presentation today. Obviously, there's so much diversity within the term Black, so many countries, so many languages, and so many other aspects of our identity. But for today, I'm going to be using Black Caribbean and Black African, or people of dual heritage, including Black Other, which again is very broad. But actually the Black Other, in terms of the statistics, Black Other isn't included. In terms of white communities, I'll be talking predominantly about white British communities, those who categorize themselves as white British or are categorized as. So not white Other, which includes sort of white European outside of Britain. So what we know already, what we know already for about 40 years plus, and so I'm going to keep this very brief, this part, is that we know, and if you don't know, then now you know, Black people have been overrepresented in inpatient mental health units for decades in the UK, 4 to 6 times more likely to be admitted on a section. And I think in 1 year, over that, in those decades, it was 9 times more likely. 10 times more likely to be on a CTO than the general population. That's a community treatment order, where they're still under the care of the hospital, under a section, but got to have supervision in the community. So I include myself in the definition of Black, so we have longer hospital stays, higher rates of readmission, higher doses of medication, which have been linked to the fear that people have of Black people. And that just brings to mind sort of my son. In school, he came home once and said that the teachers told him that he shouldn't be walking around with his friends who were all Black because it's intimidating. So there is a kind of long-standing fear of Black people, and I say that as a statement. And unfortunately, it can be sort of, it's manifested in many ways. In mental health services, it's in terms of higher doses of medication. Much less likely to be offered therapy, overrepresentation of psychosis, diagnosis, schizophrenia was a massive one. And just in terms of so there's many other inequalities, but in terms of the police, we're 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched. This is in 2020, and the police are 5 times more likely to use force against Black people. And there's probably, we're more than likely, the police are much more likely to be involved in when we're admitted to mental health units. Okay, sorry, my screen sort of stops then. But again, what we know is that we're more Black people are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act, as I mentioned, 344 detentions per 100,000 people, compared with 75 per 100,000 white British people, with Black African being the highest group. So we're talking about a radical solution here, and this isn't in any way in fact, we as Black people have had, shown so much resilience, we have many initiatives going on, unfortunately often short-term funding, and many other difficult issues that services face that are specialist for Black people in the UK. So one vision is to develop a service called Fikaweli. The vision, so as I said, we're not staying with the problems, we're just sticking with the solution for this lunchtime. One radical solution is Fikaweli, which I'll tell you about. The group started in 2020 in the context of the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And the board members are all of Black Caribbean or Black African origin. What we want to be is a trusted provider of empowering inpatient and community mental health services, and this is like a kind of statement. We want to be recognised through our practice in terms of the impact that we have on racism and mental health, on all spectrums. So basically we want to service that acknowledges all these inequalities, the impact of racism specifically on mental health. And we want to be a provider of training placements. So I'm smiling because my presentation is moving by itself. I'm kind of playing catch up. I'm not sure why that's happening. So I'll try and stay with it. But yes, and when I mentioned the idea, which is this, the vision is a 10-bedded inpatient unit for people who are Black British in the UK, and people sectioned under the Mental Health Act, which focuses on shorter stays, access to psychotherapy, and promotes medication management, which I'll talk about very briefly. When I mentioned this vision for an inpatient unit, a colleague, a clinical psychologist colleague who works on one of the training courses, asked if we'd be arranging placements. And this was before, obviously we're not at this stage, but the kind of the sense was that, are we ready to take placements? We're not, but that we're hopefully going to get there soon. Yeah, the presentation's on its own timing. What I'll do is I'm going to stop sharing and share again. 1 second, and I apologize. Right, hopefully. Okay, that seems to be working better. So yeah, so the vision is for this 10-bedded inpatient unit. So hopefully you can see that. So we've been funded initially to provide a kind of community initiative, which is called the Medication Management Program, which we were funded by, it's a community-based initiative funded as part of a culturally appropriate mental health services initiative in Manchester, short-term funding. But you know, it's a way to start. The idea would be that we can use a medication management program, both in the community and in the inpatient unit. And my sister is there on the picture. She's under Ade, and Shirley is under Life Off. My sister's a mental health nurse by profession, and Shirley's a practice nurse. And my sister's the one that had the vision for the unit. And basically with my medication initiative, people are encouraged to bring their medication. That's people with severe and enduring who have most likely been sectioned, because it's really difficult to have medication reviewed and because of the over-medication that happens with Black people. So they're encouraged to bring their medication, have a 30-minute discussion and think about how they can take ownership of their medication in terms of feeling more in control, having conversations about things like herbal remedies and things like that, traditional remedies, and you know how that will work if they take their medication, how they want to take it, and thinking about that, and just basically so that people have a voice. Oh dear, having a problem with, I don't know why is this happening. But yes, but my focus obviously is in therapy. That is my focus. Oh dear. technical issues. Hmm. Okay, so I might have to just talk, which I'll see if I can. I'm not sure I'll remember everything, but I will do my best. Because the screen isn't moving. So yes, so the idea is to set up, from my perspective, obviously, I'm particularly focused on the psychotherapy side of things and developing a therapy service. That's where my focus is. Unfortunately, as we said, people of African and Caribbean origin are not offered therapy, and there was a specific service. Oh, I think I'm going to try one more time. Sorry. I'm sorry about this. I don't know what's happening with the presentation. Okay, let's see how far we go. So, in terms of drawing on what's already happening, there was an example at a service developed by Frank Lowe in the South, and he is a sort of well-renowned Black psychotherapist. And he set up a service called the Young Black People's Consultation Service, not an inpatient service, but it just helps us to think about what it would be like to set up a specialist service. That was for Black people aged between 14 to 25 years, and offered initial consultation appointments and open-ended therapy if appropriate. He talks about, in his paper, he talks about the responses to setting up that service from the local community. And there was strong management support for the initiative. However, a number of colleagues, and this was an NHS initiative, a number of colleagues, as I understand, were uneasy about the idea of a separate service for Black adolescents and thought that it smacked of apartheid in service provision. So obviously when I read that I thought that it was apartheid in service provision. Um, First of all, I can say it's not the first time I've heard something like that at all when thinking about separate services, or specialist services, I should say. But it's also very disrespectful as well, I feel. The concept of apartheid being compared to a specialist mental health service, apartheid, which was used dehumanization as a rationale to separate people. And specialist services are about recognizing that there is a specific need for groups of people who have been dehumanized in the past, and that's a completely different thing. Local white community organisations also, so this is the service that was set up by Frank Lowe and colleagues, as far as I understand. So local white community organisations which specialise in providing counselling to young people also complained that they hadn't been consulted about this new service and felt that it should be part of the voluntary sector. And I suppose here, it's an interesting kind of conversation about who should be consulted about specialist services and so on. But when I read this, it kind of reminded me, this did remind me of the sort of divide and conquer world, where we're talking about resources and fighting over resources. And it did actually remind me of Brexit and all the kind of what was used to justify Brexit in terms of economics, the impact of immigration and so forth, the health service being overused by immigrants. So this kind of competing for services based on ethnicity is something that, in terms of consulting and who should consult is a discussion that we can have. At the same time, other Black communities warmly welcome such a specialist service, but commissioners who were still expressing concern didn't wish to fund a separate service. And in the paper, it says that staff involved in the service experienced surprising opposition and hostility from a wide range of people. So I guess what we say from that, we can see that setting up something like Fikaweli, which would be an inpatient 10-bedded unit, that's the vision for Black people in the UK, experts Section 1 of the Mental Health Act. We can see that the staff in those organisations would face many things, would face potentially hostility, well, definitely would face hostility. That would be a definite issue, opposition. Also, some welcoming as well. And I guess the welcoming would come from people who really understand or have felt the pain of being Black in Britain and experiencing mental health issues or having a family member sectioned, which myself and my sister have had. So yeah, so I just wanted to emphasize the point that it's a specialist service. It's not about this being a separate apartheid type service, which again is so disrespectful. It's a specialist service, recognizing that there is a need. If you can't see, if you, whoever you, if we can't see that there's a need for a specialist service, but with those types of statistics that I kind of spotlighted at the very beginning, which, I would go around Manchester, not me, but other people, we'd go around talking about these stats and talking about the problem, talking about a need for something. And people would look at the statistics and we'd be like, yeah, it's real. And then nothing would be done, at least not in a kind of mainstream supported way. And we'd be left in the voluntary sector, organisations would be struggling. So there is a need for a specialist service. The almost 50 years plus of statistics around Black people's experience, the number of Black people in mental health services, that's something that can't be argued with. So if in terms of Fikaweli then, if we had thinking about the staff, as I've said, they'd have to be prepared to face potential opposition, hopefully a lot of some welcoming as well, and somewhere in between with regards to people who might be ambivalent. And there's a lot of research, as I've emphasised there, about specialist area work, about Black staff, and people have expressed a preference for working with people of similar ethnicity, background, cultural background, and there's a lot of research over the years that has shown that. And that Coleman one at the bottom, that was me as an assistant psychologist trekking around community organisations in Manchester, and asking about what they would like, what people would like in going to churches, going to voluntary sector, various places, what would help people to feel they could access mental health services if needed and earlier on as well. So again, potentially controversial, but that is what the studies indicate. And this is about choice, really. It's not that I'm not saying that if you're Black, you have to have a Black staff member to work with. What I'm saying is, at least if there's choice, then that's something that's better, isn't it? At the moment, there isn't that level of choice. And there is a paper as well where, I can't see the title there, but unspoken levels of comfort. Again, it's a similar thing, which is talking about and the need for Black therapists and what it's like being a Black client with a Black therapist. And we have in the UK the Black African and Asian Therapy Network as well, where you can, if you want to work with, if that's something that's a choice that you have, to work with and identify therapists who maybe have a similar background. So there's definitely a need there. And Fikaweli potentially, will be staffed by predominantly Black staff, or people who have a really good understanding of what it is like to be Black in the UK. So we do need to have a cohort of therapists in this case. I'm talking about therapy, and a robust placement, teaching-based qualifications, and so forth. So forth. Again, if we're serious about addressing these issues, then we need to have structured programs, well supported, mainstream, not 5 months, 6 months, 12 months, even 2 years funded. We need mainstream sustained. We're talking about generations, we're talking about decades. It's not going to be solved in 12 months of funding. So thinking about this, so basically what we're saying there is that the potential staff will need to be well supported. We'll need to have a really good sort of base of staff, core staff available, and a consistent training program as well. Thinking about service users. So again, a vision for Fikaweli is that the service users will feel understood. This is the vision. And feel that they don't have to pretend, or they can stop acting, feeling that they don't have to explain what the impact of racism is. And that's the vision. But like I said before, it would be, what would the word, it would be naive to say that because you're Black, the other person is the Black, its service user is going to feel understood by the Black staff member. There is definitely there's definitely studies that show that, as I've said, but we're not naive in terms of recognizing that it's much more complicated than that. But our vision, like I said, is for people to feel understood and not having to explain the impacts of racism. Conversely, from this perspective of service users, because we Black people have had to survive racism in various ways, have had to sort of choose how we're going to be trained, how we're going to work within predominantly white organizations and so forth. There are things, understandably, that Black service users that would might potentially pop into their mind, which is, will this Black person who was trained in white institutions understand me? Can I trust this Black person who is locking up Black people? And I must admit, when the vision, which my sister had, so which is fantastic, and at the first episode, I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to think we're Black people locking up Black people. And I think that obviously the concept of being locked up is unfortunately something that is associated with Black people in the UK. And I guess what as I was trying to process it, I thought, well, what we're doing is we're caring for, trying to get people out of, back into the community, but caring for them while they're going through this stressful period. That is very different from the panic that kind of happened when I thought people would say it's Black people locking up Black people. Then there's the issue of, are they really Black? And this is, so I'm talking about Black service users working with Black professionals here. And that is another conversation, which we'll briefly touch on. So again, in terms of the system, we've got those thoughts that service users might have, and that again is based on research. It's also based on myself engaging with different services as well. It's complicated, but overall, the consensus is that taking aspects of identity into account, different aspects, the idea of being in a distressed state and having somebody who understands the impact of racism, when that's particularly relevant to your experience in the UK, has shown to be really, really, really important and beneficial. So in terms of psychotherapy itself, again, this is the work of Lowe, talks about ambivalence towards psychotherapy. And he links this to intergenerational trauma. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. So for myself, basically what that's about, so I'll talk about myself, it's the easiest way to start. So my dad came to England when he was 19, at 19, and he's 80 now. And he came to England on a boat. and faced a lot of racism. My mum she was a nurse in the UK, and she was one of the generation who was spat at, one of the generation who people didn't want to work with her because she's black. And they were busy trying to survive racism. My dad would walk around with a knife because he'd been attacked, because the fear of being attacked. And there were times when he had to kind of make a decision about running away because, he didn't want to end up in prison. So the idea of the concept, the reality of our parents being attacked, our grandparents being attacked, are facing significant amounts of racism, and that different kind of racism that it just make you cry because you think these are people, this is my family. How crazy is this? So my mum has shared a story of she was traveling in the UK and she stayed at she went somewhere and there was a landlady there, and the landlady wanted to exchange her dog for my brother. So my mum was traveling through the UK, stayed at a place where the landlady was asking my mum for my brother in exchange for her dog. Think what kind of crazy situation of dehumanizing, as I said, with such services, we're thinking about working with we who've been dehumanized, um, and supporting and understanding. So for me, as a Black mental health professional who's experienced, who's familiar with the concept, who's lived the concept of intergenerational trauma, you know, I I believe that that is something that's very rich that would help me in my work with Black people. And it's not about me oversharing my story. It's just about me being sensitive and being able to acknowledge and in some ways validate the experiences of Black patients without me oversharing and taking their space. But yes, in terms of intergenerational trauma, so my parents were busy surviving racism, and they would sort of give us tips about how to survive. But whilst they were surviving, we were kind of dealing with school and so forth. And I have a memory, well, there's two things I think that my sister probably doesn't like me to mention. But well, she doesn't mind, but she kind of cringes. Because the first one was one of the survival tactics was to parents we were told that in order to survive, we shouldn't trust white people. That was one. And then the second one was that we should be proud of our heritage. And that's kind of how, because they were busy surviving racism, those were the key messages that they gave us. And we went out into the world, we went into school and so forth. And I remember I was in the bath and I told my grandmother that I wanted to scratch off my skin. I wanted to take it off, and I'm in primary school. So you can imagine whatever I was going through to be saying to my grandmother that I wanted to take my skin off. Obviously, that I was traumatized by racism. And again, she told me that, your skin's beautiful. White people are jealous of your skin, and be proud. But those are the kind of stories that we share, that we, like I said, and the ambivalence in terms of psychotherapy would be whether you talk about those stories with a white therapist, because there's a sense of, you recognize that your parents have to struggle, they face racism, and they face racism so you could be where you are, and they dealt with it in ways that they probably, didn't want to. So there's the ambivalence about that. In terms of talking about how complex that is, because obviously it would have meant that the parental relationship was, could have been different. There's a lot of resilience in there, but the fact that your parents are impacted by racism, in terms of the impact that might have on the parent and child, lots of resilience. I'm so grateful and thankful, but it's a complex it's a complex situation. And to be sharing that for example, with a white therapist, there can be feelings of I'm not being loyal and so forth, and why am I exposing what's happening to Black people and what's happened historically? So for myself, I've returned to study, and this is part of the vision because so I've returned to train as a psychoanalytic stroke psychodynamic therapist, which I'm really excited about. I'm kind of I'm making sure that I'm reading about Black psychoanalysts as well. But yes, so as part of that training, we have to go to therapy. So I did look for a Black therapist and didn't find one. So I have a white therapist who I see once a week, and she's good, but I have to explain to her what racism is. I have to explain what the traumatic impact that racism has had on me. And we reflect on that. We reflect on the strain that it puts on the therapy itself. And in therapy, I talked about the film Get Out as well, which some people might be familiar with. And when it came back to the next therapy session, she had watched it. She'd watched the film, and we talked about it. And I had a kind of ambivalent response to that because a part of me was like, oh, right, she heard what I was saying. She went and watched the film to help kind of understand my world. But another part was, well, you kind of intruded into a part of my life. Yes, I mentioned it, but I didn't mean for you then to go and do a lot of research. I would have told you more about it myself. So it's like that kind of working all those things out. So again, going back to the training programs, they really do have to, and intergenerational trauma is a massive thing. But if we're going to set up those robust training programs, which we need if we're going to combat these decades of overrepresentation at the severe end of mental health services, then we're going to need robust training programs that will consider all these issues in terms of preparing Black therapists and white therapists for this work. Right, so I think I'm coming towards the end. I'm not 100% sure how much time I've got. I think I've got about 5 minutes or so. So I've spoken so far about the vision for Fikaweli, which I'll repeat, which is a 10-bedded inpatient unit for people of African or African Caribbean origin, heritage, living in the UK who are on a section. And that is the vision. And I've spoken about the opposition potentially to the service, the comparison to apartheid, which, is just crazy. The experiences that staff will have as they deal with those opposition, and so on, the thoughts that service users might have, potentially ranging from, I feel really understood, to can I trust this Black person who is working in a system that is racist in terms of the whole of the health service, institutionally racist. So we've got to that point, and just in terms of an example, so what I've been trying to emphasize, I guess, is how complex setting up such a service is. And it isn't going to be a case of here's some money and let's throw a few Black people in the building. It isn't like that, of course. It's much more than that. And we don't want to be set up to fail. We don't want that to be the case where it's like, oh yes, you asked us and we gave you some money. We don't want that. We want this to be taken as a serious issue, a very serious issue, and for there to be robust, well thought through support over, not for 12 months, but mainstream support, mainstream services. Okay. So just as an example of how complex it is, I'm just going to talk very briefly. If I've done a teaching session, you may have heard me talk about this before. I'm just going to talk about how we survive racism and the different identities that we might operate in order to survive. And these are not definitive boxes. I'll talk about it. They're not definitive boxes. They overlap. You can be in them consciously or not. And this is just based on my experience, basically. My experience. But what I have found is when I've talked about these before, some people have really, really identified with it. So, so yeah, so these are kind of identities that I've learned, that I've shifted through, that I've seen, and it's a way to survive racism as a Black person in the UK. So, and this is, as I say, it can be a conscious thing or not. So there is, as a Black person, you can sit in a kind of separated place. Originally, I referred to this as a place of denial, but it didn't, saying it's a place of denial didn't feel very respectful. And hopefully people are understanding what I'm sort of talking about here. And being separated means basically that you're distant from Black communities um, in terms of how you live your life, Black cultures and so on. And there can be a myriad of reasons for that. It could be that your parents told you that the only way to survive in the UK is to do that, is to separate yourself off, and have very little to do with Black communities, Black cultures. So that's separated. And it could be a case of I'm at the table, what's the problem? The table being mainstream. I'm at the table, what's the problem? And in some cases I haven't experienced racism. And and as I talk about these different places, identities, spaces, they merge, that it's not a hierarchy, you're not working through one to get to the other. Being conscious, it could be a conscious decision. I'm going to separate myself because I need to survive, I need to get to where I'm going. Or well, some subconscious thing that's been handed down. And you know, I suppose what I'm trying to do is show you how complex it is to be a Black person in the UK. And then there's the thankful yes, master, which the fact that I'm saying yes, master, you can probably guess where that comes from. And basically, it's that I'm grateful to have a seat at the table. Then there's the entertainer, which is, as people probably know, and if you don't know, as the saying goes, now you know, that entertainment was a thing that is a thing that historically Black people have been allowed to be. So we're singers, we're laughers, we're athletes. And we have this joke, which people are possibly familiar with, which is when a Black athlete wins, he's British, he's running for England. When he loses, he's the Jamaican running for Britain. So, so we've been allowed to be entertainers in sports, in music, and so forth. And in the entertainer identity, we're saying, I will pretend to be stupid so I can stay at the table. The angry, the shocked, this is the wrong table that I'm sitting at. So again, this is about surviving racism, and I hope you kind of understand what I'm saying, and hopefully it resonates for some Black people out there. For myself, in my career, I have to admit that, especially earlier in my career, I have sat in the thankful and I have sat in the entertainment place. And my parents would have had to sit in some of those places as well, not because they wanted to, but because they wanted to make sure that we were okay, that we could sit at a table, you know, in comfort, relative comfort, because you know things have shifted, but not. And one example, I suppose, with these is there's another place which is exhausted but hopeful, which is I need another table so I can work with this one, the mainstream one, when I need to. So the other table for me has been historically a gospel choir. It's been a Black gospel choir. It's been my family and so forth. That's been the other table where I get the strength to be able to go back to the mainstream and say, okay, this is what I need to do. And as I said, those different places, those different uh, shades of surviving, because they're not concrete, we're not in a box. One moment I could be here, one moment I could be there. Sometimes I might make a conscious decision to sit there, and sometimes it's just happening. What I've tried to learn to be is aware of when it does happen, and then make a choice of whether I want to sit there or not. And I'll come back to that in a second. I'm conscious of the time. So wherever you see people as Black people, you see people sitting in different places. I think the initial thing to do is to respect that we survive racism in different ways. Because I remember in one of the inpatient settings that I worked in, I challenged the psychiatrist who was bullying the support staff. I challenged the psychiatrist, um, not in a very public way, I just challenged them, not in front of everybody, I challenged them, and because they were bullying the support staff, as I've said. Um, the reason I was aware that they were bullying was because the Black support staff came and told me how difficult it was, with the psychiatrists kind of targeting them and so forth. My mind's jumping because I'm also thinking of more recently where Black staff have come and told me they're scared to come into work because they're not being given adequate protection from COVID. And the conversations that people were telling me was about racism and not being cared for properly. Anyway, coming back to this in the COVID era, coming back to this scenario, I challenged a psychiatrist because of the reports I was getting from support staff. What happened was I was marched off the site. I was marched off the site, stopped from getting back into work. And when that was all happening, the support staff, I looked around, I couldn't see them anywhere. So I'd stood up, and I guess that was a key lesson for me, which was I had to respect where they were. I had to respect that at that particular point, I could take the risk of standing up. But for some of the staff, they couldn't, that they had to stay where they had to, and as they had to, they had perhaps broader responsibilities in the family. So I had to respect that that was where, and I had to respect that I was in probably a place where I had more choice and more power to do things like stand up to a psychiatrist. And then within these identities, we have these identities as a way to survive, but sometimes we don't. We don't survive and don't survive racism. And I've definitely, well, we have moments, we have years, we have months, we have a lifetime of not surviving. And when I say not surviving, I don't mean that we're weak at all. I mean that it's the most horrible thing to live through. And, you know, I've been in I've definitely been in places where I haven't felt that I've survived or I'm surviving racism. Because there's this concept of battle fatigue, which I fully kind of hold on to because it is tiring, is extremely tiring. You know, I can't remember was it the World Cup or whatever, where the footballers went to take the goal, penalty shoots, and then was it three Black footballers they didn't sort of get the goal. And for I think a lot of Black people in the UK we kind of think like, you know, make sure you were just kind of praying that the person got the goal. And it wasn't that because of the individual player who's kicking the ball. It was because I knew, my family knew that the backlash would be about Black footballers. It wouldn't be about that individual footballer not getting the goal. So I suppose what I'm saying is, so from the experience of wanting to scrape my skin off as a young child, to hearing about what my parents had gone through, to something as a kind of watching the World Cup or whatever it was, I can't remember. All these things, hearing about to seeing the death of George Floyd, all these ridiculous things where Black people are dehumanized, living with that, you can see why some of us don't survive. But in the middle of that, there is the fantastic resilience as well. And that has to be acknowledged. So yeah, so there are the kind of, and my sister wanted me to make sure I said, yes, I developed this, but basically it's just based on what I've seen, and it's a very simple, it doesn't take into account the complexities and would never state that it did take into account complexities. It can be co-occurring. We have to respect where we see people, how they're surviving. It can be conscious, it can be subconscious. And I'll just take one more minute and say, so in terms of the thankful, the chief exec of the Greater Manchester Mental Health Service, who I spoke to this last week, about, he asked us whether we would provide consultation to the trust. And in an earlier kind of incarnation, is that the word, of my career, I would have been like, oh yeah, that's fantastic. I would have been in the thankful place. Like, wow, they want us to do some consultation. But what I did was say that we've been consulted to death. So if you want us to consult with you, then what you have to do is give us 2 of your staff members to help us to work on this vision. But I recognize that, you know, I actually paused and said, do I want to play the thankful? And I thought, no, I don't want to.
Thank you, Gail. Can I?
Okay.
We've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
Is it all right to come in?
Yes.
Just, and say thank you very much. It's really brilliant to hear your passion and experience and wisdom and ideas, and, you know, getting me thinking about lots of things. One of the questions has been asked is, what does Figurelli need from people who feel that they might have some time or resource to support it, to keep it going long term?
Get in touch. We'll definitely find something for you to do. You know, we're all volunteers. We all have we're all working. We do this in our time, in the time that we can. But yes, please get in touch. And you know, we need people. We need hands on deck. Voluntary. We need media support. When I say media, I mean social media. We need fundraisers, people to help us raise funds. We need people to help write papers, write anything. Just come along and yeah, you'll be welcome.
Great. So yeah, get in touch with Let's Face Change. If you can't track Gail down, we'll put you in touch. Should we take another question? Is anybody? There's another one. Where there are other community issues like sectarianism in Northern Ireland, racism is worsened and sidelined. Could Black leadership help with other white problems that take centre stage and intersect with race?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose today I'm talking about Black. I'm talking about what it means to be Black. And certainly we can work alongside. I guess this is where I'm focusing at the moment because, you know, but definitely we can work alongside. I don't see why not.
Yeah.
I have another question. Someone asked how racial trauma may be taken seriously by systems and policies that refuse to acknowledge or take seriously the devastating impact of it. They said, sorry, they've said as some mental health questionnaires or assessments have no reference to it at all.
So what the last slide there, what I was saying was that we've had policies for decades. We've had the Rocky Bennett, we've had all sorts of policies over the last 40 plus years about tackling racism in the NHS. And the problem is they fall because the system, the people who are implementing them, the people who have the power to decide where the money goes are operating within a racist system. So unless those people at the top sit down and reflect, and I'm not talking about them going on a 5-minute cultural awareness course. I'm talking about them having proper deep reflection about the decisions that they're making with money, the decisions that they're making about services, about what's available, you know, assessments and things like that. If those people took time and reflect, and I just want to emphasize, this is a 50-year-old plus problem. It's not like it just started yesterday. Those people who have the power to make decisions, to use funds, sit down regularly and reflect about racism in the NHS in this instance, and think about seriously you know, what the decisions we're making, how are they being impacted by racism? And I must emphasize, I'm not talking about a 2-minute cultural awareness. I'm talking about serious commitment, because they have a lot of power.
Thank you, Gail. Got another reflection and then a follow-up question. So someone's asked, or shared rather, that there's significant barriers that prevent Black people from accessing mental health care. Cultural competency medical care is the idea of medical professions providing effective care within cross-cultural situations. Do you think our mental health care units are able to deliver a cultural competent service?
I guess the answer is, at the moment, no. I suppose is the answer. Being in a hopeful place, my hope would be that with a significant amount of change and reflection, we get to that place. But I do think that there needs to be choice. So having something like specialist service would enable those types of choices.
I think that's most of the time we have for questions. If we haven't answered any other questions, we will reply in an email to people who've asked questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
I think there's a lot of thank you to you, Gail, for taking your time over this Friday lunchtime, for sharing such a great vision, being so passionate about your talk, and also being quite unnerved by the tech issues as well. I thought you did amazing to keep going when that happened. Yeah, there's a brilliant vision, and thank you for sharing that with so many of our attendees. And just on a final note, I think for anyone that's celebrating Eid, just want to say Eid Mubarak to everyone. Some of you might be celebrating today or tomorrow, but have a blessed day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you.
Let us know any feedback on how this went. All will help us, and we'll feed it back to Gail as well. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future, and get in touch if you want to be involved in either Let's Face Change in some way or in Fikawele. Will you send out slides? We can probably do that if Gail's are happy to do that.
Yeah, maybe a summary.
Yeah. And there will be a recording as well, that we'll put on the YouTube channel. I think we agreed that, Gail. Yeah.